Hey guys, here's an expanded version of the watercolor techniques we're going to go over in class today. So just if you want to review this material later or continue to work on it. So we'll start with line and wash / glazing. Line and wash is quite simply where we put down a line work, either drawing or painting first, and then wash or glaze paint over it. So I'm just going to come in with a brush pen. You can do this with a brush, with a pen, with watercolor pencil, watercolor crayon. Really, there's so many materials to use here, but the idea is just that you do a two-dimensional line drawing that will then wash the paint over. And one thing to remember here is that watercolors tend to be quite light. So often they'll look really good if you remember to leave enough white areas. So leave enough light areas so that the whole kind of tonal scale skews lighter. So I'm just going to add in, and I'm using a permanent pen here. Different pens will react with water differently and create a bunch of really interesting effects. So I would definitely recommend experimenting with this technique. And now we're going to start to work on brushwork, because this is one of the big challenges with watercolor paper, just with watercolors in general, just mastering your brush strokes. And I'm going to mix together a bit of orange and a bit of brown. So I'm adding a wet brush to the pan, then dipping it in water, then dipping it back into the paint to get the colors that I want. And I'm adding brown to bring the chroma or chromatic scale of the color down. That means I'm making the color a little bit more dull, so it's a little bit more natural. And the goal here is to just practice using your brush. Don't worry if it's not perfect, if it's a little bit kind of wobbly, that's absolutely fine. We are just working on control here, so if it doesn't end up being controlled, that's fine. And now coming in, just be sure to leave enough space between these brush strokes. So try to do everything with just one single stroke. It's really a good thing to practice when you have time, because the way you use your brush will really influence the way that the paints react with the paper, and also, the amount of work you can get out of the paper. With watercolors, we often speak about using as few brush strokes as possible. And that's for two reasons. One, it tends to create a smoother effect, but two, it means that you're not damaging your paper quite so much. So each layer you add to the paper weakens it, so we want to reduce the amount of layers. And since this is line and wash, I'm just going to add a little bit of the green to that kind of orangey brown mixture and do a few leaves. You can do whatever you like here, it's entirely up to you. And I'll do a leaf here. Having some variation also in the depth of the color is a really nice thing to do. So just adding more water to one tone you're using can create a really nice kind of layered effect. Okay, and I'm going to leave that to dry, and then we'll come back and glaze. So our next one is, we're still working on brushwork, but now we're going to see what the full extent of our brush strokes are. So still using that kind of green orange mixture, I'm going to hold my brush upside down, and then I'm going to try to use just the tip of the brush, so as thin as possible, then gradually press down, move up, press down, and move up. And see if you can do this just so gradually that you end up with kind of a wavy line. So this is we're going to make a couple shapes like seaweed here. Don't worry if it's not perfect at the first go. This isn't meant to be, an aesthetic challenge. This is just getting used to our mediums and the extents to which we can use them. So I'm just adding a little bit more water as I move in to create some different effects. And now I'm going to use a different brush, so a slightly larger brush. Choose any brush you want to experiment with. And I'm going to make a different color. I'm going to add a little bit more of the ultramarine to that greeny orange mix. And I'm going to do the same thing. So just see how far down I can press the brush, how much I can lift it up. We can have a few of these crossing over. And the more dry your paper is and your paint is, the more you'll see different layers when you do this. So we're going to leave this now and we'll come back to it later to see what the glazing effect is once this is fully dry. Okay, so now we'll just move into watercolor painting techniques. So how we actually cover ground. The first one is a flat wash. So what I'm going to do here is just pick up some phthalo blue. You can use any color you want. I'm picking it up from the well, or if you're using watercolors in a tube, you're just picking paint up. And then I'm picking up water with my brush and adding it to this. Because these are dye-based watercolors, they're going to be a lot more intense than pigment-based. One thing I would recommend doing if you're using pigment-based watercolors is each time you mix them, when you start using them, get a spare sheet of paper and test them out, wait for them to fully dry so that you know the extent to which they lighten. These aren't going to lighten an awful lot while they dry, but pigment-based watercolors will, so you'll get a different color than the one you're putting down. A flat wash is where I'm coming in with just one flat brush stroke of color, dipping my brush back into the paint, doing another stroke, dipping my brush back in. And this is a good opportunity to just practice consistency. The next is a graduated wash, which means the colors blend. So you can use any color you want here. I'm just adding a bit more ultramarine to my paint. And that's where we come in with one layer of color, and then with a totally clean brush, move in with some wider layers. So I'm just adding clear water here, and the idea is that we want to create a gradient. Gravity can be helpful here, so feel free to move your paper down a little bit to create more of a gradient effect. Now, the paper that you use for this is going to create a big difference in how smooth of a gradient you can get. If you want to create a really smooth gradient, I'd recommend using pigment-based watercolors, artist's grade, and high GSM paper, cold pressed. So cold pressed paper is going to allow smoother gradients than hot pressed paper, which is better for things like glazing, where you actually want to see the brush strokes. But here is our graduated wash here. Now the next one, you're probably not going to use all that much, but this is a dry brush technique. So I'm going to mix up some green here so that we can do grasses. I'm just going to add a little bit of green to the blue, and again a little orange to add a little bit more complexity to that color. And that's where you'll want to take an old brush, so not one of your nice watercolor brushes, and possibly an acrylic brush or an oil brush. So here I'm using an old oil brush, a hogshead brush with stiff bristles, and it's flat on top. This is where we hold our brush vertically, dip just the top of the brush into the paint, and then sometimes you have to try this a couple times on a spare sheet of paper, but the goal is to actually see the brush marks on paper. So if we're creating kind of a grass effect here, this can be a good technique to use. So up here we start to see the brush strokes. So having a sheet of spare paper on hand is good for this, just to, dry the brush out. But this can be good for making layers of grasses. I'm going to do a couple layers just to make a nice illustration. And different types of brushes will have different effects. So sometimes you'll see people using fan brushes for this, which can create really kind of dramatic, wide, kind of grass type shapes. All right, and finally we'll move to lifting out. And for this, I'm going to use a blue. Lifting out is quite simply when we lift out the paint with one thing or another. So here, I'm just going to put down a layer of blue. You can lift out color with your brush, with a tissue, or with something of a certain shape. So here I'm going to take a coin wrapped in tissue paper. I have to do this very quickly before the paint has a chance to dry. Wrap the coin up, and there, I have a moon. But a more common way of doing this, if you want to pick up color as you move along, is just with a clean, fairly dry brush. You can come in and just pick up paint. You can do this with a tissue. I find a brush gives a good amount of control, but basically I'm just applying pressure so I can pick up the color that I've put down. And now these are dry enough that I can move back to glazing. So I'm going to come in with some orange and yellows and just glaze the color over my line and wash. So remember to leave some white spaces. So I'm just leaving some white spaces here. I can glaze over, for instance, this entire thing and have the colors show through. And if you want to add a little bit of complexity to your seaweed, you can come back in and where these lines kind of move in, just create an added bit of seaweed kind of flowing through. And for instance, if we put some yellow here, notice how we move in with a few more leaves. You can see the leaves coming through from underneath this with the glazing effect. So we have some transparency there. Okay, and now to clean my water. And before I rinse off my page, I'm just going to put down a couple of flowers here just to create a nice aesthetic page and practice my brushwork. And actually with these flowers, one thing we can do, I'm just going to add this in now, is it's called spackling. So I'll write this down. And you might want to cover up the rest of your page while you do this with some paper, because otherwise it's going to just kind of chair fly everywhere. But spackling, and you can mix up any colors for this. I'm going to choose some purples because I haven't used that yet. And so this is the purple right next to the orange. I'm going to mix up some purple. I'll just keep it like this, just purple. You want to wet your brush quite a bit. And then holding your brush over the paper, you just hit it so that the color is a word that sounds very much like it is. It just sort of spackles over the page. And you can also do this like with masking fluid before you start a painting or after. It's a nice versatile technique to get, you know, some evidence that you're using a water medium.